Good evening, everyone who's joining us. My name is Stephanie Schneider, and I use she/her pronouns, and I'm very excited to be to help moderate this conversation today. Originally, I'm from the U.S., most recently Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and along with the rest of the world, have been watching the uprising that has grown since the murder of George Floyd by the hands of the Minneapolis police. And yes, we are watching one of the largest protest movements and seeing so many interesting things happen. How conversations are that once seemed impossible are now happening in regards to defunding the police and abolition in terms of both prisons and police. So I'm very happy to introduce our speakers this evening. This is part of a series of online Marxism meetings that have taken place, the place of the annual Marxism Festival in Amsterdam that happens in the spring. And this is the last of the series. And tonight we have joining us two activists from the United States, Haley Pessin, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, along with the Afrosocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus in New York, and also Todd St. Hill, also a member of the DSA and Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus in Chicago. So welcome. And to start the conversation, I would like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves further and also to describe what's been happening the past few weeks, your experiences in your cities. So who would ever like to start?
Here, I could start. Uh, so yes, my name's Haley. I'm a socialist from New York City, um, and I'm also a member of Union 1199 SEIU. I have been really amazed by the level of support that these protests have been getting. That's sort of the big theme. I am in a city that's not particularly Black. The African American population is very low, or at least in my part of the city. Um, and yet the protests here have been nonstop. I was saying before we started that there's actually protests very near to my apartment happening immediately after this discussion. So there's been almost consecutive protests. I think this might be the 19th day of consecutive protests since the protests started in Minneapolis around George Floyd, and that's been true all over the country. It's pretty clear that this is one of the largest uprisings in US history. It's touched not just large cities with large African American populations or Black populations, it's actually gone into small, rural, and even predominantly white towns. And the breadth of this is significantly up even since the start of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. So this has really been a major milestone in terms of the struggle for anti for against anti-Black oppression and against police brutality in the U.S.
Great, thank you. Todd?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Todd St. Hill. I'm also a socialist based in Chicago. Um, and yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot with what Haley said about nationally about the level of support, the breadth and uh, extent to which protests have extended to all corners of the U.S. And then again, and further across the globe. Um, I think in Chicago, speaking of Chicago specifically, um, the protests have not stopped since 3 weeks ago now. I think the first protest was like 3 weeks ago on a Friday, um, and they have not stopped. And I think likewise, we have experienced um, a higher level but familiar level of police repression. against protesters. Uh, Tens of thousands of protesters come out to protest in very large and very diverse ways, and thousands of people still get arrested by the police. And um, so currently, uh, we have been organizers in the city have both been sort of like doing double and triple time in uh, organizing protests that some have been organized by existing organizations in the BLM who have been a part of the BLM movement or were sort of born out of that movement. Um, and many more have been just protests called by like random people who've never protested before in their lives. And I think that's sort of the strength that this just sort of speaks to what Haley was talking about in terms of um, the broad level of support. It's moving people to like make calls without organizational sort of support, um, and at the same time, there's been higher levels of jail support, and even that has been targeted by the police. Um, uh, and I think all of these, the strengths of the protests are now beginning to show how they're beginning to show on the police. They're getting more and more tired. They're complaining about how tired they are. Just yesterday, there was 5 protests that happened in the same day, and during one where the police pulled a person out of their car and arrested them. Uh, the police themselves got into an argument about that, and one said that he quit on the spot. So tensions are high even within their ranks. And I think that's a signification of how much pressure they're feeling. And it's good. And it's deserving.
Thank you. Like Haley, you had mentioned about the Black Lives Matter movement starting 6 years ago, and of course these uprisings we've seen before in reaction to police killings of Black people. Um, and I wanted to ask each of you just to speak to what you feel has led up to this particular moment in the movement.
Yeah, I think that's an important question because police brutality is obviously nothing new, and police brutality against Black people. I think it's significant that the words that George Floyd said as he was dying, "I can't breathe," were literally the same words that Eric Garner said 6 years ago as he was being killed by police. Um, so it's just made this connection very obvious for people. If people previously didn't see the breadth of that brutality, then it's almost impossible not to see what it means that somebody who's engaged in, basically what's a crime of poverty. Eric Garner was selling loose cigarettes. George Floyd was accused of counterfeiting a $20 bill. The idea that that is enough to have your life snuffed out, but then we have all these other examples around the George Floyd murder. So there was the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, who was literally hunted down by racist vigilantes and killed in like a modern day lynching. You had Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her own home. You had Tony McDade, a Black trans man who was killed by police. There are so many examples just within the scope of the same period as the pandemic, let alone the last many years. And I think that it speaks to the way that police brutality is pervasive against Black people, but it's also about police brutality just being the tip of the iceberg and about the many other ways that Black people are utterly devalued in terms of health, in terms of the wealth gap, in terms of any number of figures that you can point to throughout society. And I think that the most important thing about this moment that we're in, and the reason that I see it as a big advance over where we were 6 years ago, is not just the support, but really what it says about where political consciousness is at, because we're seeing demands and a level of militancy in these protests that I certainly haven't seen in my political life, but that it also seems has not really been the case for a very long time, at least since the 60s. So you have both the way that the protests have taken highways. That have been, in New York alone, 47 police cars were burned. So there's a level of rebellion that characterizes a lot of these protests across cities. Then there's the fact that people are actually willing to engage with questions that would have been really marginalized to the radical left. So questions like, what does it mean to defund the police? What would it mean to abolish the police? Talking about people, about taking the police force apart altogether, disbanding it, and trying to figure out what other forces would potentially actually respond to things like people's mental health crises or welfare and emergencies, because right now the police, with their armed force, are the only force that exists to do that. So disbanding the police, I mean, even the fact that we're having that conversation is really remarkable in this country. And I think it speaks to the way that consciousness really, despite the level of protests around the Black Lives Matter movement kind of petering off at various points, really had a massive impact on people's understanding of the connection between racism and the police. So there's a poll that 74% of Americans understand George Floyd's death to be a matter of racial injustice. And the fact that that's up 30 points from a similar question asked around the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner show, I think, just how rapidly consciousness has shifted in that time period. So that's sort of, to me, what's important about what's different now and why it's happening now.
Great, thank you. And Todd?
Yeah, I would only add, I agree with everything what Haley said. I would only add that, the circumstances of the pandemic um, s- set up an environment for many people where we were in some ways forced to watch these incidences unroll, these incidences of racism unroll. Everything from black people being targeted for bird watching, to the horrific murders of folks like Tony McDade or George Floyd. Um, and I think in that context, right, folks were also seeing police. Uh, uh, and I think a lot of Black folks understood this to be a possibility, was seeing how the police would treat us under a pandemic, and that was with brutality, that was with overwhelming force, and it was with numbers of police descending on into Black communities, uh, while not descending into the same affluent white communities, and doing the same thing. And that was something that sort of, I think that stoked the sort of the anger and um, the the feelings of like enough is enough that we hear so much in the media and from reports from Black folks, um, being fed up with not only a system that has created police um, to harass and murder Black folks, but has perpetuated a system of racism and, like Haley said, has dismissed any sort of um, mass demands to actually undo this system.
Thank you. Yeah, I, I I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how the pandemic has, um, what role it's played, and just considering the disparities, in when looking at the race of folks who are infected and dying of COVID-19, and just maybe the general kind of failure of the state to provide anything for its people. So is there anything else that you would like to, either of you, say about the the how you see the pandemic in relationship to this movement?
Yeah, I think the pandemic is absolutely critical because, one, when you look at the demographics of these protests. I mean, it's everybody, but it's also overwhelmingly young people whose schools have had to be shut down, people who are out of work, or right now in this country, 40 million people have been rendered unemployed, and that's just the people who are able to access unemployment benefits that we're aware of. There's undocumented people as well. Who are not able to access those benefits and are also unemployed. So there's this massive you know problem that also creates, I think, the ability during the day for people to go to these protests on in numbers that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise seen. um, and at the same time, the impact of the pandemic has been to show that the government really doesn't care about us at all. I think that's been made very clear under the Trump administration in a variety of ways. But the fact that you have this massive pandemic, and people online have been sharing photos of sort of the juxtaposition of nurses having to wear garbage bags to be able to protect themselves going into hospitals, with the extent to which the police have the latest military equipment and are armed to the teeth to go up against these protesters. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but something like 11,000 people that so far have been arrested during these protests, not to mention the tear gas and the number of people who've been shot with rubber bullets, a number of people have lost eyes. It's really quite remarkable to see how much more prepared this country that we be allowed to live, um, versus the response to a pandemic that's affecting everybody, and yet in a country with no socialized healthcare, with no basic ability to provide for healthcare workers. There's just this It just makes obvious how little this country actually cares about ordinary people. And then to top it off, Black people are experiencing this epidemic at a disproportionate rate. Part of it is that Black people are more concentrated in jobs where they have to go into work and can't work from home, and in low wage work. And then the other aspect of that is that uh, in segregated communities, if you look at Chicago or you look at New York, the Bronx, Cook County, Chicago, that is the areas that have been the most impacted by COVID. And that's true in almost any city that you can look at. So it's certainly the case that this is a pandemic that's impacting everybody, and yet it's still not impacting people equal. And we're getting killed by the police on top of that. So I think that having that kind of cauldron of things, there's any number of things that people have the right to be angry about. But what's, I think, significant is that in a context where we've had to be at home, or been prevented from kind of figuring out organizationally how do we fight against these kind of cuts, there's been an uptick in labor strikes, but now there's also these protests on top of that, demanding that we actually have not just defunding the police, but also that all of these other services that have been totally gutted, especially in Black communities, actually finally be given what they need to actually be able to live in general, but also to be able to respond to this horrific pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, in the course throughout the course of the pandemic, how it both exacerbated the conditions that Black folks have been living under, and have been worsened since the recession of 2007, 2008, and then again worsened again economically, like Katie said, as a result of the pandemic. Um, this it's unveiled what the to the rest of the world what Black folks, what people of color, what poor people experience on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, I think that was hammered home much more heavily in the course of the last three months, that poor healthcare, poor living standards that are not constructed of our own, uh, leave us incredibly vulnerable to things like global pandemics. um, the the other thing that has popped up in the wake of the government completely failing to address the needs of ordinary people is the mutual aid that has popped up in places like New York, in Chicago. And I think that has shown, that has demonstrated in action what, the slogans, the sort of liberal slogans of "we're in this together." It has actually been working class and poor people who have demonstrated that, yes, we are in this together. Not only that we are in this together, but we actually can organize ourselves outside of without this, outside of, and unfortunately without the support of our local governments. We should have them, but we don't, obviously. um, we could organize it amongst ourselves and actually be successful in providing them some of the resources, at least basic resources that people need. Um, I think that it, at least for the U.S., it shows that like people still have compassion, and that is sort of um, the safe haven for that compassion seems to be in the working class people of this country, the poor folks in this country, and people of color especially. Um, but but also that we can we can actually structure a new society, possibly, and a new way of organizing ourselves in order to get the things that we need, without capitalism. And I think a lot of people, particularly the organizers, um, and some of the protesters who have taken part in the mutual aid programs, are starting to realize that. And I think that's uh, in these places where like alternatives lie. Um, and I think that is sort of where alternatives to policing, um, will come about, and um, have come about in the past.
Yeah, thank you. I can see from my own previous town, Milwaukee, that the same networks that were providing this mutual aid have now kind of adjusted and stepped up into a new role in the protests as well, whether it be providing the same mutual aid, or also leading demonstrations with new connections. Um, and Haley, you mentioned also the idea of defunding the police, and I think for me to this has been one of the um, most surprising developments, that this is becoming part of mainstream conversation, and along with abolition. Would just ask you, just if you could speak to these demands that um, um, people are making about defunding the police, or abolition in terms of prison as well as police forces.
Sure, absolutely. So I think that, like I mentioned earlier, this has been a demand uh, that's mostly been initially confined to the margins of the radical left and of anti-racist, abolitionists. But the fact that this has become a mainstream demand, I think, is pretty remarkable. I think it's also easier to see in the context of the pandemic. Here's what we do have, and here's what we don't, and you compare the budgets even for police departments, which in many places completely outstrip healthcare, education costs, childcare costs combined. So the question is, first, why is that the case? Are we just that uncreative in coming up with ideas about, how to provide things? And I think what's actually the case is it's not an accident. It's that police budgets are never cut in when we're in the context of austerity, and when we're in a context where they're telling the rest of us that we all have to sacrifice together. The rich never have to sacrifice, so they're not taxed. And between those two things, you have communities that are already underfunded getting even more of a short end of the stick. And so they actually need the police to respond to these things. They've accepted the fact that police will kill people on a certain level. That's why you see massive amounts of money, to the tune of millions of dollars, that are, states put out essentially as payouts, for the families whose loved ones are the victims of police brutality. So that's just become an accepted cost, and it's necessary to contain populations that are most likely to resist. And we know from the history of Black struggle in particular, because of the centrality of racism under American capitalism, that every time Black people have resisted, it's raised all kinds of other questions about the entire system. And in a way, we're seeing that today, where people are saying, if this is what police departments are doing, why do we even need them? They're not actually keeping us safe. When police respond to mental health crises, or they're the ones who respond when somebody is, sick. They're not people who are at all equipped to do that. They're literally a mechanism of social control and of brutality, and they're not the force that should be there to respond. So there's now more of a thought process of, well, what would it mean to take all of the money that is currently going into those departments and actually making our communities less safe and giving us what rich communities actually have already to keep us safe, which is actual quality education, actual quality healthcare, actual quality jobs and resources that are currently not there. So one thing I'll say about, to me, what is important about the demand and why I think the left needs to support it, because I think there's a debate. There's a lot of concern, rightful concern, about this demand being watered down or even co-opted, or whether it goes far enough. To me, the demand to defund the police for us needs to be a demand that's linked to the long-term goal of abolition. It's a very different demand than some of the demands that I was seeing even in 2014. Where people said we just need more Black police officers, or we need body cameras. In fact, what's interesting is a lot of liberal politicians are still proposing reforms like that, which we've actually seen in practice don't prevent the police from killing people, and don't diminish their power, but actually means giving more funding to the police departments, simply don't work in practice. So I think that any demand that's actually going to be in support of the long-term goal of abolition has to be one that actually takes power away from the police. And the stronger our movements are and the more organized they are, the better we're able to actually define those demands ourselves, and not have them be stripped away by essentially people who pretend to be our allies at election time, but really, in fact, are trying to find ways to diminish the power and the radicalness of that demand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The the what's often missed about about abolition and about demands to defund the police. I think the perception is that you get rid of the police and then we don't have anything, chaos, and that's not exactly, and that's not what the activists from the Black Lives Matter movement. That's not what abolitionists from generations ago, from decades ago, have framed abolition to be. And I think it's that's one side of defunding the police and disbanding the police, is getting rid of them, because Haley is right. Like, it is a question. It's not a question uh, of of I don't know what the benefits of the police are. I'm sorry, but it's not a question of that thing that people claim. It's a question of safety for uh, for our communities, and safety for communities that have already been divested from for generations. And that is something that I think in my experience, um, those forces, those liberal forces that purport to be our allies during election times and only during election times, uh, uh, are afraid or unwilling to truly address, because you don't solve. I mean, there's no one. There's so much that you don't solve. You can't solve violence with the violence of the police. And I think that's the going notion that rests within abolition, and within the call to defund the police. That in order to stop, to address violence, we have to address this violence of the state. And when we are addressing the violence that happens in our communities, that happens in every community, not just Black communities, it has to be a nonviolent response. That in these practices already exist in our communities. They are not funded by our local government because they are not controlled by our local government or the police. They're controlled by grassroots organizations, working class people. Some they're incorporated into labor union practices, into the practices of folks like teachers and things of that nature in the form of restorative justice practices and transformative justice practices and peace circles and things of that nature. Um, in Chicago, we had an organization of mothers whose family members were taken from them by gun violence. They created an organization that actually went into the communities and did peaceful demonstrations, block clubs, spoke to each other in the communities, and actually helped to de-escalate and stamp back some of the violence that was happening in the communities, and that none of that was funded by uh, the local government, and that's what people are demanding, right? Take these resources, this money that police are getting. 40% of our operational budget in Chicago goes to the CPD, and take that money and put it into these nonviolent uh, and many more programs that would actually rebuild uh, communities that have been left anemic of resources. Um, the last thing that I'll say, and to Haley's point about like what is being offered now as defunding police. In Chicago, our mayor has offered, among other things, right? She's offered mental health services to police who were attacking protesters. She's also taking money meant for COVID relief, 330 million to be exact, to give to police for overtime for the protests that have happened over the last 3 weeks. Like this is the response from the Democratic Party and Chicago is a Democratic Party stronghold. This is where the party constructs their much of their strategy and their policies and things of that nature. They test them out on folks in Illinois and the people of Chicago. So this is their answer, and it very much so mirrors some of the reforms uh, that have come from the Democratic Party on a federal level.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking now of the kind of two institutions that are often thought of as on the left of the U.S., the Democratic Party, of course, and then the labor. And Haley, I know you mentioned you're a member of 1199, and we also have a question from one of our viewers, Ramon, who's asking um, uh, if you can talk about also the struggles against police unions, and maybe also broadly how both of you see what's been labor's role or reaction in this movement as well.
Yeah, so in terms of labor, it's been there have been some very inspiring examples of labor being in solidarity with the protests. So two that come to mind are in Minneapolis and in New York. The respective bus drivers and their unions refused to drive arrested protesters to the precincts. And as we know, the precincts are disproportionately being impacted by COVID-19. There's no way to socially distance. People are in really dire circumstances there. That's the worst place to be right now, and we should be fighting for people to be released as one of the demands. But it's just to say that that's a pretty remarkable example of labor solidarity with this protest. In other places, there's the challenge of how sort of embedded labor unions have been in the Democratic Party, how tied they are to those interests. And so in other places, like here in New York, the teachers union, the United Federation of Teachers, has been much more reluctant to come out against the police union, or specifically against Mayor Bill de Blasio, who, came in on a record of reform, specifically reforming the practice of stop and frisk, where 80 to 90% of those being stopped by police for marijuana arrests were Black and Latinx. So, and he has really done absolutely nothing. He's only very, very recently, because of the protests, committed to any kind of defunding of the police. And, it's just a drop in the bucket. It's definitely not nearly enough. And it's not what we would have gotten without much more support. What I am impressed by is the way that some rank and file members of these unions are challenging their own unions. So last Saturday, I was at a protest that was organized by MORE, the Movement of Rank and File Educators, which is a reform caucus within the UFT. And they basically organized a massive rally. I think it was about 2,000 people. That rally then met up with two other protests that were happening at the same time that day and grew to about 20,000 people. And the people who were speaking were students who've been arrested by police because of the presence of police in schools, or who have been harassed, really calling for schools to get the resources they actually need and to get cops out of schools. And so I think that's going to put enormous pressure on the UFT to take a stand. There's also a petition going around. Unfortunately, I don't know offhand where it came from, but it's come to my union. It's come to a number of other legal service workers that I know, basically saying that we need to get the police union out of the AFL-CIO, which unfortunately has been a member, and that's been a long-standing battle. I think this is the closest that we've ever been to there being real, genuine support for that demand. I think it's more possible, or more in reach than ever, at least if we continue to pressure and to continue to find other avenues for labor to be involved in this struggle. And then the other thing is, you mentioned, what is the kind of role of the Democrats in all this? I think that that's especially important. It goes back to why I think this movement needs to get as organized as possible, and for us to actually have our own demands that aren't tied to what any politician is saying, but are really saying, are you going to commit to this? And really seeing that, the power of people in the streets has already won concessions from the state without any politician than we've seen in decades, in a matter of weeks, which is really fantastic. But right now, Biden is against defunding the police, and even Sanders is against defunding the police. He's, right now, the biggest figure on the socialist left is actually behind the curve of where the movement is. And I think that's something that we need to not be afraid to be incredibly critical of, and we need to move ahead. So that's going to be a challenge, but it's obviously an important one to take on.
Yeah, I would only add in Chicago, the we've seen some inspiring stuff, and it's mostly come from the teachers as well. The Chicago Teachers Union, in terms of holding rallies, demonstrations to get police out of schools, is one of the things that came up in their last strike. Um, Last year, that wasn't like I don't think it was like a major demand, but it's come up now, right? And it's become a major demand coming out of teachers unions, particularly. And I think they're in the process of fighting for that demand in particular, and also um, getting behind other labor organizations, more grassroots labor organizations in the city to put forward a proposal demanding that they go through every line by line the police budget, the Chicago police budget, and start taking out funds that are not used. I think that's a modest start for in a place like Chicago, whose labor force, particularly public sector workers and like nurses, bus drivers and things of that nature, are and teachers are less so teachers, but they're predominantly people of color and Black folks that make up these professions. Um, home health care workers, things of that nature. So I think here we're asking labor unions to one, um, get on board with the demand to defund the police, and then two, um, the policy and pushes and everything that's happening in the city are good and are a good start, and we should figure out how to push for harder demands of our city council, because we are in a unique position in Chicago where we do have a minority of aldermen, but we do have 6 aldermen who are socialists, openly socialist aldermen who have, uh, as of the last 3 weeks, shown up to demonstrations, to jail support, to protests, have sided with the movement unequivocally, and have been instrumental in holding unity marches and things of that nature across different communities of color in support of uh, defunding the police and of Black lives. So we have an opportunity to push for harder for push further in terms of demands, but we also understand that these policies don't get won in the halls of in city hall. They get won in the streets. And so we also are asking strongly that unions mobilize like they do for their strikes, like they go all out for during strike campaigns, go all out for us right now and defunding the police and defending Black lives, because a lot of these places, I mean, over the course of the last couple of weeks alone, you saw um, Black workers, organized and not organized, um, not coming into work, walking off the job, demanding that, raising issues about racism in the workplace, and actually winning. This is a I think that labor has an opportunity to move from a position of strength in this moment, and we shouldn't, like, folks shouldn't be afraid to do that.
Thank you. I'm interested because both of you are members of the DSA. Um, the role of how the role the DSA is playing in the movement. Seemed to be a lot of energy around, of course, the Bernie Sanders campaign, and um, you've already mentioned his position on the demand of defunding the police. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how that is that energy shifting, or what's happening with the DSA at the moment.
So I think that this movement is really putting a lot of challenges, as any movement would, on existing organizations. So obviously the DSA, with 60, close to 70,000 members now, the it's an organization that exploded within the last few years, predominantly around the campaign of Sanders, but also around different areas of activism, like um, the protests around the Women's March, the protests against the Muslim ban, where people were mobilizing to the airports, and around the election of Trump. I think that the movement is forcing people to consider what it means to see change as not just coming through electoral vehicles, or just popularizing specific demands, but to actually think through, where does our power lie to win those demands? And so I say that because I think that there's lots of people in DSA who have seized this moment and are going to the protests and are providing mutual aid and doing a lot of important things. What I'm kind of arguing as a member of DSA, and obviously there are many different political tendencies within DSA, is that we actually have to make a much bigger organizational shift. I think that and I don't just say this as a criticism of DSA, I think that the truth is there's not really a force on the left right now, maybe aside from some of the Black grassroots organizations, that we're not caught a little flat-footed in this moment. Obviously, we couldn't have predicted that something like this would happen when it did around the protests in George Floyd, that it would have this massive impact. But I think now that we're seeing what it means, we have to be all in. And there's also a strain on the left for economic reductionism, where essentially people argue that we need to have universal demands, like Medicare for all, like the Green New Deal, any number of things that would help working people in a broad way as a way to also help particularly oppressed populations. And what I think that we need to argue is that we're seeing a struggle that's actually not explicitly organized around those demands, but that is raising them in an even sharper way. I mean, what better case than the impact of the pandemic on Black communities specifically is there for Medicare for all? But also for those specific communities to be, to be addressed in the way that they need to be, because there's an absolute crisis there. So it's not enough to just say we need this universal demand. We actually need to challenge the racial structures, or the racist structures rather, that exist throughout society in terms of policing, in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of our healthcare system, if they're to actually impact the entire working class. So I think that we need to win an argument within the left about the centrality of the struggles against oppression and how those struggles can actually help advance the struggle for socialism in the long run. They're not two separate struggles, and Black people aren't just suffering from racism and not from economic inequality, or we can't take those struggles on separately. We're actually going to need to see them as a linked struggle if we're going to win. And the last thing I'll say is I mentioned earlier that, especially in New York, there's such resistance to ever taxing the rich. And I think that we need to defund the police, but actually we also need to tie that to demands to prevent people from having to go back to work before it's actually safe to do so. I think that's a place that labor can have a really big impact, and we have to tie them to demands to actually make the real looters pay, because there's all this focus in the media about people looting during the protests, when in fact the rich got $400 billion richer. So the money is there, but it's going to take an even bigger struggle and uniting different points of struggle for us to actually win those demands.
Yeah, I would only, and I agree with everything that what Haley said about the current state of the left and some of the challenges that we face. I think that in response to DSA specifically, um, on an organizational level, right? In to answer this, to try and like challenge or contend um, with the reductionism that exists among on the left. I think the Afro-socialists and socialists of color caucus in that I am a part of, and I think that Haley's a part of, has made some headway both within the organization, within DSA, and even outside outside of DSA, in sort of trying to address this issue, and one, create a place for radicalizing uh, Black folks and people of color, and Indigenous folks who are open to socialism, curious about it, consider themselves socialists, to come and actually develop themselves politically, so that we may be better organizers in the world. And I think having caucuses like that would only benefit organizations like DSA, in terms of having a place for people, for Black folks who understand, for people of color who are skeptical about organizations like DSA, but are socialists, or consider themselves socialists. Uh, and sort of tangentially, it's also able to, the Afro Socialist Caucus has also been able to um, help to shift some of the internal workings of DSA, that in a beneficial way, for folks of color. Um, beyond that, I think that um, this will, if we continue to in this direction, we'll actually be able to engage with Black folks on a massive level, um, and in ways that Haley was saying, in ways in using practices that exist outside of our most dominant ways of like engaging with politics, particularly elections, um, and decision making through local municipalities and things of that nature.
Thank you. My final question, and then we have some questions from viewers. But my final question is kind of the where do we go from here question. Um, and I'm curious to know, and you've touched on some of the debates that are happening. But what is the conversation looking like in terms of building this movement um, in the future?
So I think that the first question, even up to a few days ago, I've been talking with people kind of trying to get a handle on like, is the movement in kind of, are we at the crest of this movement? Or do we have further to go? And it's just a hard question to answer. And then the police keep killing people. So in Atlanta, there was a man, Rayshard Brooks, who was just killed by police, and there've already been massive protests on the interstate highways by protesters taking to the streets. So it seems like um, there's a real potential for this to continue. I do think that it matters that there's a big enough organization like DSA, or that new organizations begin to form out of this moment, because there's really no shortage of demands that we could be raising right now. The possibilities are really quite endless. And I think that we're in a moment where people are more open to the need for radical solutions, even if not everybody identifies as radical. The conversations that we're having because of the protests and people seeing, that protesting works, that this actually has won some change in a short period of time. All of that is stuff that we should be pushing as much as possible, trying to create more spaces where people can actually become involved in this struggle on a more long-term basis, because it's obviously not going to be won overnight. But there's, I think, just a question of, to me, the last period of struggle in 2014 threw up some organization, but not as many spaces for people to actually get kind of plugged into this movement and have political debates. I think if we can create more forums for those debates, but not just in the abstract, but really linked to what do we do next? People are doing incredibly creative things right now in Seattle. They're actually experimenting with this autonomous zone, where essentially they have kicked out the police and do not have police. And it would be really beneficial, I think, to have networks where we can actually learn a lot more from the successes and challenges that this movement comes up against as it unfolds. The other thing to note is it's only 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old, which is still remarkable. This is like the most concentrated 3 weeks that I could think of, where so much has happened. But I think that that level of organization is going to be the question of, can we move, in a way that allows us to sort of withstand the ebbs and flows of protest activity. We know that this is going to continue until, we actually have a different kind of society, I feel, because I don't think that we'll actually be able to abolish the police so long as we have capitalism. But we certainly are in a period where weakening their power, weakening the even just basic legitimacy that both the police and the government have at this moment, is really much more on the table. And that I think is going to be what it will take to take the movement forward.
The only things that I would add is that, yeah, the immediate next steps are, we need we need to build up people's skills, not to be overly organizationally oriented, but you know, when in the early days, 3 weeks ago, when people were um, first in protesting, you could tell, at least in Chicago, you could tell that folks didn't know how to hold a line, didn't know how to um, get past a police, break a police line, things of that nature. Um, Marshalling, having medics trainings, mainly for our own, obviously to build up our organizational muscle on our side, but also with an understanding that, you know, the police are, they will do everything to break up a protest, use all manner of violence, and including up until and including preventing, probably preventing ambulances from coming to the scene. So we need those skills in order to continue to continue to advance this particular movement and moment in time. Um, and I think in the long run, as sort of the organizations that are showing up now, in the long run, that will benefit the left. Having those skills, having that, developing that organizational muscle. I mean, it's that organizational muscle that allowed uh, that helped facilitate this response. um, Having those organizations that were born out of the BLM movement in 2015, having them now has only benefited us. Um, and continuing to build off of that is the thing that will benefit us moving forward, and is the difference between now and 68. You know, in many ways. So I think for me, that's the immediate next steps. I, like Haley, find it difficult to figure out what the long-term next steps are 3 weeks into um, uh, a movement. But yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to share with you now some of the comments and questions that have been on the feed. The first one I have from Yannicka, and you've talked about the role of labor, but she says, I'm curious to learn later in the discussion if and how the little examples of workers' actions resonate amongst the protesters. Um, the bus drivers who refused to bring protesters to jail in Minneapolis, if teachers in NYC demanded to keep police out of school. There were the dockers across the states holding a short strike in commemoration of George Floyd at the moment he was buried. Um, yeah, is there anything additionally that you would like to add in terms of how these uh, things have resonated with folks on the ground?
Yeah, I I think that just in general, the level of solidarity, whether it's been in terms of labor or in terms of the level of international support, has been incredibly heartening for people. I think that the challenge is just the fact that in the US, labor has been very weak for the last 40 years. We started to see an uptick in labor struggle around the teacher strike wave in the last couple of years. Um, and I think that that has certainly resonated with people, but I think there's still, I think we still have a ways to go to kind of put on the table the idea that um, that this is part of where our social power lies to actually win demands, to have political strikes that are actually related to winning demands like defund the police, or to doing more of, to sort of generalizing um, the significance of what people like the bus drivers did in kind of stopping the wheels of the police force, literally. And so um, it's hard for me to say how much that's resonated. What I do know is that we're in a context where wildcat strikes have been happening around the pandemic, and because of what I said earlier about the concentration of Black workers in low-wage work, in jobs where they can't afford to work from home or aren't able to. It is no doubt to me that those are people who are part of the protest, whether they're doing so as part of an organized labor presence or not. And the question of what happens when they go back to their jobs is going to be really important, because I don't think that people's consciousness is going to change even if these protests were to die down tomorrow. I think that this has had a really irrevocable and widespread impact on people, and especially Black workers, I think, are going to play an important role in where this struggle goes next.
The next question we have from Elmer. You mentioned the proposed abolition of police in Minneapolis. What is it like in reality? Is it really as good as it sounds? Seems like something that can only happen in a revolutionary society. Media in the Netherlands even tone it down by translating it as reforming the police.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've never experienced a place where the police have been disbanded. I've only been to suburbs where wealthy suburbs where there aren't many police, and that feels great. Um, I think uh, I I think what I have a hard time being convinced that in the absence of police and the presence of more of like robust infrastructure in previously impoverished communities, that things would be worse. Um, so so in that regard, I would imagine that things would be better in Minneapolis. I think there are examples over all over the world of countries and states that have, and even in the U.S. that have disbanded their police departments. Um, in many cases, from what the little bit that I know in history, in many cases, they've replaced it with another police force. Um, but they were for reasons that exist today. The police force was corrupt. It was racist. I mean, you could find those departments in New Jersey, in Missouri, and now in Minnesota, hopefully. So I think the question this time around is, upon disbanding the police, there is no recreation. There isn't a recreation of the same police department. Um, there is actually an investment in creation of meaningful, effective alternatives. And I have full faith that those exist, and that if they are actually funded in the ways that the police departments across this country are funded, they'll be incredibly effective, more effective than the police.
If I could just add, I just wanted to say a word about Minneapolis, where this call to disband the police department is taking place. So there had been, a long-standing effort by people in Minneapolis, ordinary people, grassroots movement, against the level of police brutality by the Minneapolis Police Department. And the mayor was actually elected on the basis of reforming the police department. And that, his tenure as mayor is the context in which George Floyd was killed. So here you have, a liberal Democrat mayor, as you do in many of the main cities across the country, elected on this reform platform, saying he'll reform the police department, but in practice, nothing changes. And so the interesting thing is there's that protesters actually physically went to his home, confronted him, and asked, "Are you for disbanding the police? Are you for abolishing the police?" And he said no. And he was booed, and people he literally to walk through this long line of people, of protesters, all booing him, saying, "Go home," and shaming him. So I think that shows the sort of the militancy of the moment that we're in, and the unwillingness of people to sort of accept more, minor tweaks to the system here or there, or minor reforms. On the other hand, there's many liberal outlets that are trying to report on the demand to disband the police as well. It doesn't really mean, or to defund the police, even, as not really meaning we're going to totally defund the police department. We're just cutting its budget. So I think that there's going to be real attacks on the Minneapolis example because they don't want that to spread. And they don't want specifically the lesson of what the protesters are doing to spread. And so that's kind of our job, I see, as us going forward, to make sure that that those demands can't actually be watered down, that we make very clear that when we say defund the police or disband the police, we mean defund or disband the police, and we mean that we want the money that's currently going to those organizations to actually go to the social programs and social services that we need, and that are actually the way to keep us safe. Now, I don't think we're at the point where the demand to abolish the police is necessarily a mainstream demand, or a demand that tons and tons of people are open to, but more people are certainly open to the demand to defund the police. And I think that our job on the left is to try to take people from that demand to examples, to actually imagining what a society without police would look like, and that it would actually be a much better society than the one that we have.
Thank you. Niels says a really interesting panel already. Thank you, comrades, for sharing your analysis in terms of racist policing and the militarization of police and the fight against that. What lessons do you have for us in the Netherlands?
I guess I could say, I think that we have to see these fights as international fights, because the militarization of the police force in the US is sort of on two fronts. One is that essentially, after the Watts riot in 1965, where you had a massive civil rights movement, you had massive protests, and you finally had protests that moved from the South to massive rebellions in the North as well. This was before the US had a more professionalized police force, and the police were actually not able to stop this rebellion. And after that point, there was sort of a decision by American governments: we need to actually professionalize and retrain our police force to operate more like the military on the home front. And so, I think that the fact that the weapons that police have in the US, I mean, they have tanks, they have, things that are essentially from the role that the US has played abroad, in imposing its own interests on other countries, in diminishing democracy and making it harder for other oppressed populations to fight against their own dictatorships. In particular, I think of the example of Palestine, and the fact that police departments in the US have literally gone to Israel to receive training and share information about racial profiling. So that's a pretty obvious example of the way that these forces get built up, and the way that they share the tools of oppression between the different ruling classes in different parts of the world, in order to better oppress their local population. So, I don't know. I would love to know more about what kind of struggles you all are having in terms of policing in the Netherlands, whether it's in terms of migrant populations or who's impacted. But I think the other thing I'll say is, in the US, I think there's a lot of potential for us to connect the struggle against policing and to defund the police to the demand to abolish ICE that came up earlier, because there's obviously a lot of connections between the immigration apparatus and the way that immigrant populations are policed and deported in the US and even detained. I mean, the detention centers are just as filled with COVID as our prisons are. And so I think that the more we're able to connect struggles, that impact people locally to struggles abroad, to different struggles within different countries, the stronger our movements will be.
The only thing that I would add is that I think we're learning a lot, / a lot is emerging about the political power of police via their unions, in the sense that, in like disproportionate power to other unions, to other labor, to other unions. I think figuring out how to and how police sort of impunity is tied to is tied more so to those like labor contracts and things of that nature. Um, Figuring out how to actually uh, rein in that power as well, especially when there's a growing call for um, there's growing talks about police not or having their pensions being taken away after for killing innocent people. I think that's one major thing that we can look at, and also look at uh, in other countries. I'd be interested as well to know um, what is the relationship of local police to the political establishment, to electoral politics and things of that nature, because it is. Um, I think it's a pretty big factor in why demands to defund the police, at least from like the Democratic Party and things of that nature, and the establishment figures within that party have um, quickly shifted the conversation to reform, um, uh, and why reining in police power is so difficult on a political level, and it's because of their um, relationships to the different parties, to the two-party apparatus, um, and the entire electoral system of this country. Um, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to read this question, but I, I I'm thinking you may have addressed this already. But Jack also asked about Minneapolis, and you mentioned some more reformist measures, but there are headlines stating that Minneapolis Council voted to abolish its police department and replace it with community-led institutions. Do you see this as a promising measure, or is it a noisy reaction? And you can address that further if you like. But I also want to include some another question. We have two questions that have to do with the upcoming elections in the U.S. Brett asks, do Haley and Todd believe that the Democrats' response to the murder and BLM protests have been adequate, or do they think that Biden in particular has been dragged to the left by the protests?
Yeah, so just a final thing on the Minneapolis thing. I think I mostly answered that, but I will just add that, I think there's always potential for these things to be rolled back. I think there's already, as I said earlier, efforts to kind of not actually make this about abolishing the police force, or even the word they're using really is disband, not abolish, but to make it, to try to walk back what the city council has promised. That said, the fact that they're even having this discussion is because of the movement. I think that that's absolutely an advance. It shows what's possible when we do protest, and we do so militantly. And it's also a testament to just how widespread the support is for this movement, that this is even a discussion that's happening. I mean, the New York Times had like 3 different articles having discussion and debate about this question which we weren't even discussing years ago. So I think that has to be understood as a victory, whether it's a short-lived victory or one that we're able to sustain is going to be a question of how this movement grows and gets organized from here. In terms of the Democrats, I mean, I think it shows yet again how radical this demand is. But what my bigger concern is not so much that we're able to force Biden to move left, which at this point he's actually just so out of touch with where the movement is. Immediately after the protests had gone up all over the country, he said that he's not for defunding the police. He said he's actually for giving more money to the police departments. And remember, I said that the police departments across the country are getting more funding than education, healthcare, and most social services combined. So he's saying he would put more money towards that. That'll only increase the ability of police to continue to monitor and survey Black communities, to stop and frisk people, to contribute to the portion of the population in jails. And really, what I should mention is all of what I'm saying is the Black population in the US is 13% of the population, but everywhere they're disproportionately likely to be killed and incarcerated. But the actual numbers of, for instance, white women in prison are on the rise. The numbers of white people killed by police are also astronomical. And so I think there's a basis for building solidarity there, because the fact that they use racism as a justification for the police, the idea that Black people are more dangerous and commit crimes as a way to criminalize and protect the wealth of a minority that actually harms all of us, is exactly the reason that it's so important that we challenge racism, as well as it being a crucial struggle in its own right if we're actually going to fight our own oppression. But I think that the bigger danger is not so much that Biden is, or the Democrats in general, are just going to try to co-opt the movement, even though that is a danger. I actually think there's also a danger that they're trying to push in the other direction. Whether that means that Trump could win again, I don't know. Right now, his numbers are dismal because he's attempted to pose himself as the president of law and order, and it's backfired on him. The military has refused to follow his orders to demobilize the protests. Major Republican figures have even come out in support of the protest, and whatever that means, how sincere they are or not, it shows that they know which way the wind is blowing. And so I think that it's unclear what that will mean in terms of the elections, but I do think that we're going to have to keep fighting and keep being in the streets if we want to resist not just co-optation, but also moving further to the right in response to the protests.
Yeah, I would say that the fact that that there are Republicans that seem to know which way the wind is blowing, and the Democratic Party has offered the reforms that they've offered, is telling in terms of both where the party is on this issue and where it's not willing to go, and um, and where the movement should be addressing, where the movement should be orienting itself, and that's not towards elections. In this moment, I think that there will be a pull, as there always is, in the coming months towards um, towards elections. And I think that you know Joe Biden is going to. The only thing that I'm certain of is that Joe Biden is going to continue to dig himself a political grave. Um, he is, yeah. That's that's mostly that's all that I could really say. It's a shame to it's a shame and not surprising to see how Joe Biden has or what positions he's taken on this issue, but also in the months and weeks leading up to the uprising, you saw Joe Biden flounder and flop and say racist things towards anti-black things um, uh, during interviews that signified what his relationship is towards Black folks. And I think I think it's one of a unspoken sort of subordination to Joe Biden. And I don't think that that is something that um, I don't think that's something that might be true for the establishment, Black political establishment, but I don't think that's true for the people who have shown up in the streets in the last 3 weeks.
If I could just add, I think that what both Todd and I are speaking to is just the reality that there's a deep political crisis in this country where neither the Republicans nor the Democrats are willing to go past a certain point. And so that raises a question. I don't know if we're at the point where it's possible to talk about forming a new party, but I think it really points to the necessity of one if we're going to get out of this, quagmire where we're literally talking about a person who's in power um, calling for looters to be shot. Trump was about to have a campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the site of one of the worst racist massacres in history, on Juneteenth, which is a celebration amongst African Americans of their liberation from slavery. And he was forced to cancel because it was so utterly racist and so widely condemned. But that is sort of the choice we have is between someone who was about to do that and willing to do that, and someone who isn't even able to see the demands to defund the police, but also who was a major architect of the system of mass incarceration that we see today. Biden was a major backer of the 1994 crime bill, which expanded felonies for minor drug offenses, which expanded things for which the death penalty could be used against people for crimes. This is really no choice that's actually going to uh, move this movement forward. And so I think Todd is absolutely right in saying that the place for this movement to advance is not going to be in this next election cycle. It'll be interesting to see whether the pull that this electoral cycle has is as great as it has been in the past, because we are in a system with only two parties, and that often means that people feel that they have to choose between the lesser of two evils, and that pull is very strong. But I think that this movement is going to have a significant impact on that. And if there's any potential for us to at least argue and try to figure out where can we get organizationally stronger, and ultimately where can we have political parties that actually represent the interests of the movement, and break with the two-party system, then that would be a really wonderful thing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so the other, Elmar had a question about the election, and I'll read that and then share another question that on a different topic. It says, in addition to this, what are your expectations for the election? Trump might wage an even more racist campaign, as he cannot really play make the economy great again card, since it was already ruined, and even more so with COVID-19. Obviously, Biden will not be able to channel the rage and level of consciousness that is now emerging. So if you would like to take that question into account, anything else you want to say in regards to the election? And in addition, Ramon asked the question if you can both say something about the practical organizing work that you are doing on a daily basis. And it continues, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen.
Yeah, that's the perfect quote to encapsulate this moment. I keep thinking about that. In terms of practical organizing, so I'm involved in a couple of different things. So I mentioned I'm a legal service worker with 1199. What I have been doing has been working with a group called Legal Workers Rank and File. It's a New York-based group where we work across different unions to try to make our unions more militant. We've been trying to figure out ways to raise demands in this moment that will actually help the movement. And I'm not an attorney, so this isn't specific to my job within these organizations. But one of the problems we've faced is that the number of arrests has been so great, and police have been keeping protesters past 24 hours, which is the constitutional limit, in these terrible conditions, which once again expose them even more to COVID-19. And so what they've been doing is trying to set up additional basically court hearings, so that people who are sort of forced to work overtime in order to accommodate the number of people they want to process through the system. And normally in normal times, our job is just to get people one at a time out of jail. And so it's not a very effective way to advocate for people. And if anything, it's kind of like a conveyor belt. We're not really doing anything that impactful in order to actually assist anyone. And so the question has come up, well, what if we actually refuse to staff these arraignments? What if we actually use our power not as attorneys and legal service workers, but as workers, and said, we're not going to allow these additional parts to be set up. You have to stop arresting people, because otherwise you're actually not going to be able to continue to find space for these people to stay. Now, we have to do this in a way that's in solidarity with the movement, but it's a real question of, what's a more radical thing that we can do that will actually assist in this moment. Another thing that I'm involved in with the Afrosocialists is there's a real hunger in this moment for education. So we're obviously out on the streets protesting on a regular basis. Some of us are helping to bring, bottles of water and, mutual aid kind of support. But I think that there's a real desire on the part of lots of people. I actually heard that one bookstore sold out of all its prison abolition books and books around mass incarceration and Black liberation. So that is really inspiring to hear that people really want to know not just what can we do in an immediate sense, but why is this happening, and what does it say about what our goals should be. So we've been trying to put together a number of educational forums that are more like teach-ins, where we can take a step back and try to think through what is the history of Black liberation in this country, and why is it central to the struggle for socialism. So that's been one way that we've been doing organizing in addition to the protests.
Yeah. In Chicago, we have, or at least I've been similarly involved in the Socialists of Color Caucus, mostly in sort of attending some of those educationals and bringing folks that are recruiting people to those educationals, because like Haley was saying, there is a desire for political education in a way that is stronger than maybe than a few months ago, or maybe over the last couple of years, in an effort to try and figure out what the alternatives and what the solutions are, and understand the current demands. But there's also a hunger, at least in Chicago, or a need rather, that folks have identified, who are on the ground for organization, um, in recognition that uh, the existing organizations, though they've been impactful in the last 3 weeks in responding to this moment, were not nowhere near as large enough to recruit and take in as many the people that are the tens of thousands of people who are showing up to demonstrations. And what we mean by that is recruit the folks who we can to organizations, and train people too, so that when they go out to protest, not only are they trained to uh, actually win, but they're trained to keep themselves safe and defend themselves. Um, and that's a need, that folks have identified night after night, um, in the last 3 weeks. So we're currently in the process of constructing something on an organizational level, whether it's in a coalition form or a network or whatever, that can facilitate the needs of the protesters as we're identifying them as they are being identified for us by the protesters. Um, and that looks like that could look like anything from infrastructure, organizational infrastructure to training programs. And the other thing is we are reaching out to our allies and our comrades um, to get folks, for lack of a better word, in formation, because this is we understand that this is a serious moment where um, we both have the opportunity and the need, the very deep need to fight and win. Um, so we're building up to that. Um, I can't echo more the need for political education in this moment. Not because there's a such a weakness in it. Actually, one of the features of this moment is the strength of politics that are coming from the protesters. Um, but the questions and the challenges that we have to address, I think people are more, particularly the organizers, the folks who have been sort of in the trenches, for lack of a better word, for the last 5 or 6 years, and more, are um, there are questions and challenges that we're more willing to address head on. So in that regard, it's an exciting moment.
Great, thank you. This will be the last question. I really want to thank you both for joining us. I know I've really found this conversation interesting and informative, and I appreciate you sharing your perspective and your insight. So I will ask the question, and then if you also want to include any closing remarks, um, any book recommendations, I leave that up to you. So Brian says, we all grow up in this bigoted society. People who are victimized by racism can pick up on some of it themselves. That's how rulers want divide and rule to work. So there can be distrust among um, anti-racists. For example, distrust of anti-racists who are white, which is understandable, of course, but not helpful. If this is this an issue in the U.S.? How do we overcome sectarianism and build bridges? Thank you.
That's such a wonderful question. I'm glad we're ending with that. So thank you for asking. And thank you again for having us. This has been really, really wonderful. Yes, that is absolutely a big issue. I think that it's a big issue, especially in a moment where we're seeing some of the largest multiracial protests in US history. I don't think this is necessarily a widespread feeling, but I think that on the one hand, for people who've been doing this kind of work for a long time, it is kind of surprising because it's felt, like you're banging your head against a wall trying to convince people that this is that the police are racist, even some basic things, much less that we need to abolish them. And suddenly there's this massive opening. It can be hard to kind of square that with where people have been, how quickly consciousness is moving. And so I think that um, we have to actually look at what's happening again, understand that our actions in this moment really do matter because they make an impact on people, whether we're aware of it or not. And as Todd mentioned, it's affecting and impacting way more people than we could possibly even organize into the existing organizations right now that we have the capacity to build with. But on the other hand, I think the other issue is, especially on the left in the US, a lot of the left is, organizations that are predominantly white. There's always this question of what the role of white people in the movement is. And I think that what we're seeing is these struggles are already being led overwhelmingly by young Black people who are fighting against their own oppression. And I think as socialists, we have to, take the position that people need to be in the position to fight against their own oppression. But I think solidarity is also crucial, and understanding it not just as sort of like an act of charity that you're just morally outraged about racism, but actually understanding we have this saying in the Black Lives Matter movement: when Black people get free, all of us get free. And I think that that really communicates the idea that if we advocate for those who are most oppressed in this society, we actually aren't just talking about the issues, or we're not limited to talking about the issues that affect those people. We're actually talking about why it is that those people have to be in that position under these social conditions. And I think it is absolutely about divide and conquer. It's about making it less possible to have a united movement that's actually able to fight for all the things we want in this very rich country, for example, but anywhere really. It's a tactic that the ruling class uses everywhere to try to prevent us from being able to have a united struggle. So we need to win people not just to sympathy with the movement, but to their actual interest in fighting against all forms of oppression if any of our movements are to succeed. Um, I think that there is on the left a little bit of reticence. I know this is certainly true in DSA, where it feels like it's unclear, or people are a bit uncertain about what their role is in this movement. And so there's a way of going to the protests without actually saying, well, how can we help to build them? How can we help to build them in a way that actually looks to some of the work that Black organizations and anti-racist organizations are already doing that? How do we make that work more successful? So I think that that's something that is not yet common sense in the movement, but it's something that we can only win more people to in practice by actually showing up and by actually showing the commitment of these organizations to fight racism in practice. The last thing I'll say is I highly recommend, if people aren't already familiar with Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? That's still one of my, absolutely critical texts that I go back to all the time. And it feels more relevant than ever. It has real insights into why the prison system was developed in the first place, but also really what it means to imagine a world without them. And I think it's relevant to the question of police as well. And then rather than another book, I'll actually recommend a podcast. There's a podcast called Intercepted that's hosted by Jeremy Scahill. And he recently had an interview with a wonderful abolitionist named Ruth Williams Gilmore. Her interview is one of the best interviews I've ever heard, really, about why we should be abolitionists and what it means in practice. So I can't recommend that podcast enough. So thank you.
Yeah. I think that the question was how do we combat sectarianism in the movement?
Yeah, yeah, and build bridges. I think, yeah, and kind of addressing this distrust of anti-racists
Mm.
um, under who are white.
Yeah. Uh, the only other thing that I would add to what Haley said, because I think Haley really hit the nail on the head, is that there's a lot to be said and that isn't said about how solidarity is built through struggle. And I think how effective that actually is on like a practical and organizational level. Um, yes, it is like it's important that people. I think in the last few years, actually, uh, what it takes to be in solidarity with Black folks and anti-racists has sort of been diluted, in the sense that like all it is that you show up to a protest or come to the front of the protest when there's danger. And I think that's not all of it, and I think that's by a long shot. I think that that stuff does help build trust and in a way. But I think that there are more ways to show up in a movement and to participate. Um, and actually participation on a political level, discussions, debate, things of that nature also help to build solidarity. Um, I think I've in my personal experience, in terms of like the idea of allyship and my allies to the front and things of that nature. I think uh, I have been very much one and still am to the idea that, you know, like what Haley said, people from oppressed groups have the right and should have the right to organize and fight for themselves and for their own liberation, um, and in so doing, should be at the front of of these things, of whatever demonstration, and um, I think that it does a number of things, including building confidence, including just demonstrating that like we have a right to, as Black folks, as people who are oppressed, to um, and should directly confront racism, and we should do that with our comrades and allies by our side. Um, but like that as the thing that actually builds solidarity over the long term, and uh, I think the some of the lastly, some of the books that I've been reading over the last few months that have helped me um, leading up to this event, to these events, and just sort of rethink what it means to be an anti-racist, um, and what it means to and democracy, even what's at stake in this country right now. I think one is, I find it to be a classic. It's a Dying Colonialism by Franz Fanon, and the other is recently came out, Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I found that to be um, very useful.
Well, again, thank you both for joining us. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in and has been watching along with us. And just to say, yeah, all the solidarity here from the Netherlands. And it's just, it's, yeah, I'm astounded and amazed by what's been transpiring and how that's just inspired, all the corners of the U.S. and around the world. It's really quite exciting to witness this. So appreciate it and thank you. All
Yes,
right.
thank
Thank
Well,
you.
you.
have a great evening, everyone, or day, whatever your time zone may be. So thank you.